Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
You've read about the importance of opening a Roth IRA and buying ETFs, but how do you do it in practice? In this episode, Aaron and Trishul go through the introductory building blocks of saving and investing. Often, the fear of making mistakes prevents you from taking that critical first step. From choosing a custodian and the correct type of account to figuring out how to transfer funds, what to invest in, and how to place a trade, they go step by step to help you overcome analysis paralysis and take action. So don't hold off. Invest as early as possible and give yourself plenty of time for your money to grow. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hey, Aaron, great to be here today, and thanks everybody for listening.
Great to be here as well. Today, we are going to try and get very basic in our advice. This is kind of starting at the beginning, kind of simple advice that we would give to friends and family members, especially in their early 20s who are just starting out. And a lot of it actually, I was helping my sister and some other friends with kind of the things we're talking about today. And sometimes it's just like taking that first step, talking about, okay, I have just a little bit of money saved up. I want to invest it. How do I do this? Do I do a brokerage account? Do I do a Roth IRA? Do I do a mutual fund? How do I invest in ETFs? And so today we're going to kind of go through some of the simple starting out financial advice. And honestly, there's many other blogs that have talked about this. This is readily available to the masses, but it's a really good discussion for kind of the basic building blocks. And I know past conversations have been more advanced. Today we're going to try and start at the beginning so that you can understand some of these distinctions as we go along. So, Trishul, I mentioned I have actually helped my sister open up her first Roth IRA a couple weeks ago, and we funded it and placed a trade. Have you actually helped any friends or family members with something like this recently? And what were those first steps of that conversation?
Yeah, it comes up from time to time. And the notion usually begins with an individual, maybe they're kind of getting started in their career and all of a sudden they've paid down enough, maybe student loans, or they've saved up and got that mortgage on the house under control. And then all of a sudden some savings start to accumulate. And then the question comes, okay, now what happens with this money? And at that point, some of these questions do come to light.
So, were you actually walking them through how to open an account? Like, did they ask you those questions? Because I know for the last few times I've had this type of conversation, I noticed some kind of trepidation of doing it wrong. That's like, okay, I don't want to make the mistake, and that leads to just kind of leaving it in cash and not taking action. And sometimes just kind of the feeling of opening an account online and trying to put money in and try and make that first investment can feel a little daunting. And so for my sister, is just by walking her through the steps and showing her kind of, most online brokerages have a really good step-by-step process. They try to make it intuitive for you. But because she understood those steps, she felt more comfortable taking action. I was wondering if you had made a similar observation about that, the kind of trepidation and not knowing which steps to do.
Yeah, I have noticed that. And I think you did also highlight something where things have certainly changed over the years and decades. Whereas in the past, I remember opening up my first accounts and you actually had to go to the bank and even this was a time when even if you were working with a broker, you went into the broker's office and you actually signed paperwork and you did things that way. Whereas now things are far more streamlined. I remember my first investment account was with Scottrade, and they used to have brokerage offices all around the country. And you went in, even though they're a discount broker or one of the earlier discount brokers, you still had the notion of meeting with somebody, filling out forms, not quite understanding what the whole process is about, but maybe they're, helping you through, one step by step through the process. But this, at the same time, you still need to make some important decisions. And often it might come to the point where they might say, okay, now you need to ask your tax professional, like he's in your back pocket or something. Or he or she is in your back pocket. But at the other end of the spectrum, it's kind of where we are now. Like you said, things have changed considerably. Now there's plenty of discount brokers out there, and they're all competing for business, and they've all made this process a lot simpler to follow and understand, which is great. But there's still some important questions that you need to think about in terms of what type of account are you opening, and what money are you going to put where, and what are you going to invest in. So it does lead to still some notion of analysis paralysis.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really good point. That just that analysis process is very common. I think it's okay for people to acknowledge that they're not alone. That like the feelings they have don't make them kind of strange or weird, or doesn't make them uneducated, doesn't make them unintelligent. These are normal feelings that many people go through, and just like everything else takes time and experience, maybe a little education, and it's okay to make mistakes sometimes, and we'll take those little baby steps, and as you grow more and you learn more, you become a little more confident, and eventually you get to where you're trading options like Trishul.
Hopefully sparingly on the trading options if we've fully digested that options episode
Okay.
a few weeks ago.
So I remember for my sister, the first thing she because she had a 401k through a former employer, she already had an account with Fidelity. So I think that made it just a little easier. And I don't mean like a brokerage account, it's just like an online registration account where they had a username and a login. But even if she didn't, companies like Fidelity and Schwab and TD Ameritrade, although they were just bought by Schwab, any other that you can think of, like, would you still recommend Scottrade in terms of just going online and creating a username and password to be able to access or create an account?
Yeah, they're all quite similar. I don't think there's a big difference between them. Scottrade was acquired by TD, which was acquired by Schwab. So there has been a lot of consolidation in the industry. But at the same time, there's been enough competition so that a lot of these discount brokers have evolved to make things as simple as they can be.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, they've also provided a lot of price competition, which has driven down the cost of working with these discount brokers pretty much to the point where you likely won't be paying much, if anything at all, to actually set up the account, maintain the account, or even place the trades themselves.
Yeah. So again, I tend to agree. I think they're all pretty similar. I'm fairly agnostic. If you already have a Schwab account because a former employer had your 401k to that, great, stick with them. If you have a Fidelity or TD Ameritrade, I think they're all pretty similar. But first step, we go to their website and create that username and password. If you already have it because you have a 401k, great. Then most of them have an open an account button. It's usually kind of top left, very very beginning. And so this was the first series of questions for my sister. It's just kind of quickly trying to decide, is this a retirement account or a taxable account? You also hear retirement might be a qualified account because there are certain tax qualifications and tax benefits that you get if you follow all the tax rules. So qualified versus non-qualified would be another way that these accounts are referred to, but retirement accounts are qualified, non-qualified accounts are taxable accounts. So that was the first step. So when you try and kind of ask a friend or family member a few questions to figure out which one should we do, what are some of those questions that you tend to use to be able to provide quick guidance?
Initially, one of the key things to think about is, what is the money for? Is somebody really saving for retirement? Are they saving up for a new home? Are they saving up for, buying a car? So that's one of the big questions. What is it? What's the purpose of this money? And that gives some insight into just where the money may end up, because Aaron, as you mentioned, there are accounts specifically designed for retirement that have certain tax advantages. And if money is indeed for retirement, those are the first accounts that we want to think about.
That's a great point. I think that you're absolutely right. And based on some of our past conversation, I think time frame matters. So I think for this conversation, we're going to say, if it's for a car that you might purchase in the next year or two, leave it in cash. In fact, just you don't even have to open an account. Leave it in your bank account where the money already is. Same thing even if it's a down payment on a house. If you're going to looking to buy a house in the next 2 years, leave it in cash. You don't even need an investment account. This would be, you need it to grow. It's longer term, maybe on the scale of 5 to 7 to 10 years. Or like you really know, okay, this is probably going to be for retirement. And so you can have a little more confidence that you're not going to touch this money for a long time. So the first step is, okay, we know it's not the down payment on the house. It's not the car. I think we'll probably have to talk about, like, is it for a kid's college education? I think it's worth having that side of the conversation.
Right.
But for right now, we'll say, okay, this is probably retirement-ish money. Don't plan on touching this for 20 or 30 years. So it's probably going to be one of those qualified accounts. So then it's, okay, most likely do we do a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA? Okay. So do you want to give a quick primer on the difference between a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA?
Yeah, happy to. So we definitely dug into this distinction in longer conversation. So we'll certainly place a link to that in the show notes. But the notion is, with a traditional IRA, you're placing money in pre-tax, meaning income taxes on earned income have not been paid on that money. So if you earn $6,000, that $6,000 can go directly into the traditional IRA. And again, it's in there pre-tax. And what that means is, when you're ready to take the money out at that point, then you'll be paying your taxes, whatever your marginal income tax rate is at that time. And the flip side to that is the Roth IRA, which is post-tax money, meaning you earn that $6,000, you pay your taxes, and whatever's left, then you put that into the Roth IRA. And the difference or distinction there is that money will grow. And then when you're ready to take that money out, you don't have to pay tax because it's post-tax money that went in. Taxes have already been paid. So that's a benefit of the Roth, or the big distinction between the two.
Okay, so husband and wife, they earn $100,000 combined. They each put in $6,000 to their respective traditional IRAs, which are pre-tax. And instead of paying taxes on $100,000, they're paying taxes on $88,000. But if they put $6,000 into a Roth IRA, they still have to pay taxes on that $100,000 of household income.
Right.
They grow tax deferred, which is another key phrase. I think we're going to use that to compare to the taxable accounts, but they grow tax deferred. You don't pay taxes while they're growing. Then when you go to take money out, usually after age 59 and a half, because that's one of the IRS rules, the traditional IRAs, you pay taxes on how much you take out. The Roth IRAs, all the growth that has been tax deferred, it comes out tax free. In fact, everything comes out tax free because the contributions were post tax as well. So traditional IRAs, tax deduction going in, taxable coming out. Roth IRAs, no tax deduction going in, tax-free coming out. Here, I think it's important to explain, if your tax rates stay the same the entire time, the math says it doesn't really matter. That if you were to put in $6,000 into your traditional IRA or pay the taxes on that $6,000, so let's say it's 25%, you put in $4,500 in your Roth IRA, you let both of them grow the same rate of return for a long time frame, then when you take it out, if you had $100,000 in your traditional IRA, you take that out, you pay that same 25% in taxes, you net $75,000. That would be the same net after taxes that you would have in the Roth IRA. So if your tax rates stay the same, it doesn't really matter which one you use, just in terms of the math. The reason I tend to recommend the Roth IRA as a default is there's this element of forced savings, because people don't think about their Roth IRA contribution as, oh, I need to account for the taxes I owe on this money. They don't think in terms of $6,000 in the pre-tax or $4,500 in the Roth. They think in terms of $6,000 in the traditional or $6,000 in the Roth. And now they make the same contributions as they grow at the same rate of return. The account balances are the same, but as you take money out of the traditional, you pay taxes on the money coming out. And so you've kind of, without necessarily realizing it or tracking it, you have saved more in that Roth because you're actually paying the taxes on that money with other money. You've reduced your spending or increased your tax bill up front somewhere. And it's almost an element of forced savings that the Roth IRA ends up being the great default. That, yes, if you do the math and you try and compare it, the tax rates don't matter, but saving $6,000 in a Roth is actually comparable to saving $8,000 in a traditional IRA. And here the distinction is, because there are IRS rules and limits, you can't actually put $8,000 in that traditional IRA pre-tax. There's lots of other things, but there's limits on how much you can put in. So if you were to max out each of those, then you're effectively saving more by using the Roth IRA. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm also a big fan of the Roth for that reason. And there's also a few other benefits I find with the Roth. One is there's this notion of RMDs with the traditional IRA, where RMD stands for required minimum distribution. And what the IRS is saying is, after you reach a certain age, I believe it's 72.
72 now.
Yeah, now recently bumped up from, was it 70 and a half or
70 and a half? Yep.
Yeah. So now it's 72. But basically what the government is saying is, if you have a traditional IRA, once you hit 72, you're going to be required to take money out of that account every year thereafter based on a certain withdrawal schedule. And that requirement isn't there with the Roth IRA. So that there's a distinction there where if you don't need to take the money out, your money can compound and grow tax deferred for or grow just longer without you having to use it within the Roth. So that benefit is basically saying that with the traditional IRA, if the government's saying you need to take money out, well, that means you're going to have to pay taxes sooner than you may like. And the government is saying that for the traditional IRA because they kind of want their money sooner rather than later. They want their tax money at some point. And they're a little more indifferent with the Roth IRA simply because they've already received their tax money before the money went into that account. So that is a pretty good distinction between the two. And I think it helps tip the scales, in my mind, at least, in favor of the Roth. There's also a few other subtle points about the Roth that do provide some benefit. For example, if these funds end up passing on to heirs for a traditional IRA and for a Roth IRA. Both of these accounts, according to the Secure Act, they need to complete their distributions by year 10. But at least with the Roth, you can let that money, again, just accumulate on a tax deferred basis until that 10th year. Now, the last point I want to kind of make with the Roth IRA is also that there's this ability to pull out your contribution, not the earnings on that contribution, but the actual contribution without paying penalties. So that's also something to think about with a Roth IRA, which you don't quite get with the traditional IRA.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's enough other subtle benefits to the Roths. The one thing I want to point out is that there are income restrictions on making contributions to a Roth IRA, where you have to have your, I think if you're single, it's under household income, or it's modified adjusted gross income of $139,000. That might be 2020. I think 2021 might have gone up a little bit. And if you're married, it's under, it's like 194 to 206, I think. 198 in 2021 up to 206. So yeah, just double check the numbers, but there are income restrictions on Roth IRA contributions. But you can also, it's possible to do a backdoor Roth IRA, and that's a two-step. You're making a non-deductible contribution to a traditional IRA, so you're not getting a tax deduction, and then you're doing a Roth conversion of that amount. But I think that's not the point of today's conversation. Today, we're going to choose the Roth IRA over the traditional when we can, when this is going to be retirement dollars.
Aaron, I can understand why some of this stuff may not be as basic as we would like it to be, given, just some of these things you do kind of need to think through a little bit. And I do frankly have a sympathy for individuals trying to kind of decipher this, because you can imagine calling up the broker and asking, okay, now what do I do? And, they might give you some high level notion of, this is the difference between pre-tax and post-tax, but it'd be pretty interesting if you actually got the full story on what might make the most sense, given, RMDs and tax rates and backdoor Roth and all of these nuances. So frankly, I do have a good amount of sympathy for what individuals have to go through to kind of decipher this stuff.
Yeah, I think that there's a difference between like having a financial advisor, friend, or family member that you can call, like just double checking, because the conversation with us, like, do you need this money for anything? No, we want it to save for the future. Okay, so you're not going to use it for house, not going to use it for college education, you're not going to use it for anything short term. No, but we have this extra. We're aware, so we should invest for the future. Okay, let's use. Is your household income under 190-ish? Like, yeah, we're not even close to that. Okay, we're going to use a Roth IRA for both of you. It's like the conversation was really, really fast, but it's because I knew the questions to ask to get there. And so right. I could see how, like, from my perspective, it's like 2 or 3 questions. From their perspective, it's a lot more research and IRS rules that they want to be careful of.
Yeah. And I just imagine that for, the broker is not going to give you that information just because they're probably going to say, go ask your tax professional.
Yeah.
Your financial professional.
Okay. So we are now opening a Roth IRA. We're going to actually do this for both husband and wife. Okay. So they each need their own Fidelity or Schwab login, or TD Ameritrade, or your broker of choice. So they each create their own login. We follow the account to open a Roth IRA. And this is going to establish the account. There will be a variety of questions to ask, like, are you an employee of a financial institution or a registered investment advisor? Are you a U.S. citizen, or do you have a social security number or a tax ID? There'll be a variety of questions like that to answer. You've now opened up your Roth IRA, and now we need to fund it. So most of these do actually do a pretty good job of, if you provide the ACH information for a bank, this is the routing number and account number. It's what you see on the bottom of your check for your checking account. You provide your routing number and account number, and it can pull the money from your bank for you. So we're going to do $6,000 into the Roth IRA. The reason I kind of make this distinction, because when we get to the taxable accounts, it's the money in and money out of retirement accounts is what matters in terms of taxes. The money in, money out of the account itself is what we need to kind of be aware of when it comes to either filing taxes or tracking for future years. For taxable accounts, the money in, money out actually doesn't matter. There's no income restrictions, there's no requirements, there's no tax concerns, there's no IRS limits. So for non-qualified accounts, we don't have to worry about the money going in, money going out. All the taxes are based on the trades inside. With the Roth IRA and all the qualified accounts, we just need to be careful of, okay, we can only put in $6,000 for the Roth IRA this year, okay? One special distinction for people, and that's what came up with my sister, you can make your 2020 contribution up until April 15th of the following year. So in this case, we made 2020 contributions even though it was January 2021. So you are allowed to make those contributions into IRAs, both traditional and Roth, for the prior year up until the tax deadline, April 15th. So, and realistically, you want to make sure you're doing it before you file your taxes, because you have to actually indicate that on your tax return, especially if you're doing a pre-tax or traditional IRA. But we did a $6,000 one-time pull via ACH by providing the bank account, routing number, and account number. The next step, though, is placing the trade. Just moving the money into the account doesn't mean you're invested. Even though you're in a Roth IRA, you can actually have a Roth IRA that just has a savings account inside it. There'll be a default money market option. You can actually go to your bank and open up a Roth IRA and use the same savings account that you use regularly and have that as the funding vehicle for your Roth IRA. You can use a CD inside a Roth IRA. So sometimes for some people, that if they don't have that Fidelity account login or that Schwab, sometimes the easiest way to just open that first account, especially if there's getting closer to a deadline, is just go to your bank and you can actually open that Roth IRA before the deadline and fund it with cash from your checking account. And it's because at the same institution, it's very, very easy. They can help you with that. But at least you've met one of those funding deadlines, and then you'll figure out how to invest it later. You can transfer it later, but it's a key distinction that the IRA as the account type is different than the investments inside it. And this will come up a few times. So anytime you're thinking about Roth IRA, that's not necessarily going to be invested for you. The account type we're distinguishing from the investments inside that account. So have you ever recommended to someone just go open an IRA at a bank?
No, not specifically. I think it might only come up if, like you said, if you're under that very tight deadline. But traditionally, if you can just get it done at a discount broker, that might just take an extra day or two to get the funds over.
Yeah. It's rare. It's only happened once that I can think of. But yeah, it's they already had the login. They just needed to get that deadline in, and we actually did it for them. We did an after-tax contribution to a traditional IRA, planning on doing a Roth conversion, and just getting the money in before the deadline was the more important part.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So after we have $6,000 in your Roth IRA, and we do the same thing, $6,000 in your spouse's Roth IRA, Now we're going to talk about what to buy, what to purchase, how to actually place a trade and make an investment. And here I can see Trishul and I disagreeing just a little bit, even though I think we're both fundamentally on the same page. You could use a mutual fund, you could use an ETF, you could actually buy an individual stock if you wanted to. But my default recommendation for kind of friends and family is using the American Fund's Growth Fund of America. This is an actively managed mutual fund that's all stocks, but it will change the weighting between domestic and international, between US and non-US stocks based on their economic outlook. And I like this because they have shown that they can be more aggressive than just the S&P 500. I think that they, in the past, they actually take on more risk to try and target more return. I'm not saying that they can outpace their benchmark per se. I am saying that they just simply take on more risk to try and generate more return. But Trishul, what would you recommend for kind of making it as simple as possible to invest in a either mutual fund or ETF?
Yeah, to kind of keep it simple, I would probably suggest a target date fund from Vanguard. It's just a passive fund that tries to understand where somebody is in terms of their years until retirement based upon their age. And then what it will do is if they're many years from retirement, then the individual will have a more aggressive allocation. And as they approach retirement, then that allocation will automatically be ratcheted down without any other outside human intervention. So you can kind of set it and forget it. And you'll do kind of okay, a lot better than if you had to do a lot of movement and a lot of stuff on your own in between now and the next 40, 50 years, perhaps.
You know what? I think that's a great point. Both you and I have the same mentality of put the money in the Roth IRA and then forget it for 20 years. Make sure it's invested. Don't leave it in cash for 20 years. But we're setting up a really good process for don't look at it for 2 decades.
Right. Yeah. The only caveat I'd say is if it was somebody with an actual client of mine, I would do something a little bit different. I'd follow an asset location strategy, but that's probably beyond the basics of this conversation. But the high level there is I would just be looking at the entire portfolio across all the retirement accounts and the holdings of the clients in a taxable account to figure out what goes where. But again, that would just be more complicated than a simple one-off basic allocation.
You know, I agree that the target date funds, I love those as a default. If you don't want to kind of spend any time or energy, just go with that, and that's great. I tend to think about the American fund, the Growth for America. I think because it is riskier, the return expectation would probably be greater than the target date funds. Even at the 2060, they're still going to have a small allocation to bonds, and that allocation to bonds will increase over time, and so that is reducing the risk you're taking on. But I think that for most of these people that I'm trying to help, I'm just setting them up for a long time frame. There is the implicit acknowledgement that yes, we'll have to make this change at some point. It might be 20 years later, but that we probably want to make some kind of change down the road. And that, so I kind of acknowledge that, you know what, the target date fund, again, probably doesn't actually need to be changed at any point. If that's the only thing you ever use, you're actually probably going to be okay. That they'll keep your allocation in line, even through retirement. It's going to be probably an appropriate allocation. They do a pretty good job of kind of those current those current income strategies. That's still a good default allocation for the vast majority of the population. So I do like yours, where if you think that this might be kind of one-time advice for a friend, then yes, the target date fund. If it's someone a little closer that you feel like they're going to come back to you every few years for kind of quick tips, then I don't mind being a little more aggressive. The one thing I was thinking is do you know if there's a target date ETF? Or are they all the Vanguard index mutual funds?
Well, I've seen them mainly through the mutual funds, but yeah, I'm not sure specifically.
Okay, so in the past, there's kind of was an important distinction between mutual funds and ETFs. Usually, it came to if you're going to do systematic purchases, mutual funds were just a little easier. ETFs, you'd had to kind of purchase shares of the ETF, and sometimes it was a little less intuitive for dividends to get reinvested. It worked a little better for mutual funds. That distinction is kind of faded. Mutual funds and ETFs, they're both. I'll use the S&P 500 as an example. Choosing a single stock is very risky. It can go down, it can go bankrupt. So the first way you reduce your risk is buying lots of stocks. But buying lots of stocks will require thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a good diversified asset allocation. So ETFs and mutual funds pool a lot of small investors together and then give them kind of a proportionate ownership of the 500 stocks in the S&P 500. So the ETF is just pooling thousands, if not millions, of investors together, and then we're going to just give you access to all the 500 stocks in the S&P 500. Mutual funds work similarly, but there's usually some kind of manager making those choices. So you can kind of talk about the active versus passive in a moment. But both mutual funds and ETFs kind of work the same, so that you're getting access to a very diversified portfolio, and you don't need to have those hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement the diversification yourself. The mutual fund, American Funds, Growth Fund of America, they will choose how much to put in U.S. large cap, U.S. small cap, international, emerging market stocks. The target date funds, the fund sponsor, so this is in case Vanguard, will have their rules-based strategy of we are 30 years away from retirement or 40 years, depending on your age, and the target date fund you choose, we're going to allocate 95% to stocks, 5% to bonds. Of that 95%, we're going to allocate this much to US and this much to international. And then as you grow older, as each year goes by, we'll make an adjustment slightly with slowly increasing that bond allocation and decreasing the stock allocation. But with mutual funds and ETFs, the basic idea is that we're pooling lots of money together so that you can get that diversified portfolio. You don't have to implement it yourself. You only need to buy one thing. Do you want to add anything about kind of distinction between mutual funds or ETFs? And then you can also add in the kind of active versus passive discussion.
Yeah, happy to. So with the mutual funds, typically that was the more traditional model of investing in a pooled vehicle where you have a certain amount of shares of that particular mutual fund. And there are two main types, open-ended and closed-ended. With an open-ended fund, basically when you purchase into it, they kind of just make new shares, and you get they take your money and they basically grow the fund by that amount by purchasing new shares of, for example, with the S&P 500, a small percent of the 500 companies based upon the money that came in that day, for example. But with a closed-end fund, there's a set amount of shares, and those shares are basically traded. So once those shares are created, well, if you want to get into it, you have to buy those shares from an exchange, and that means somebody is selling their shares. So the price of the shares are essentially the price of the value of the stocks weighted by their allocation within the fund. And with an ETF, well, that kind of stands for an exchange traded fund. So it's a fund that's traded on an exchange. It's a closed end, meaning the number of shares that are out there are the number of shares that are out there. So when you're buying and selling, they're definitely being traded against other shares that are already in existence. Now, a few of the differences are, for example, with an ETF, they're traded throughout the day on an exchange, like you trade a stock itself. So you have an intraday price based upon what's happening right now. Whereas in a mutual fund, if you want to buy into it, typically what happens is you place your order and it gets settled overnight such that those shares show up in your account for the following day, meaning you can't sell out of it at the middle of the day today. If you wanted to sell out of it, you would sell your shares and you place the order so that at the end of the day, you'll get that price. So there is, by just construction alone, there is this difference in how the two are traded. But these days, they can be also quite similar. For example, if you have a passively managed ETF or a mutual fund that are basically doing the same thing, you're going to find that their performance over long periods is essentially the same. There's no major difference. In fact, with Vanguard, for example, they have their indexed mutual funds or their passively managed mutual funds, and you can, in fact, convert them into their ETFs. So all they'll do is they'll convert the actual shares. They won't sell them and buy the ETFs. They'll actually do the math on their end and change their accounts so that you're now owning those ETFs rather than those mutual funds in the correct proportion in terms of how much you had invested. And in fact, it'll be a non-taxable event. In the eyes of the government, you basically have just shifted your ownership in the same interest into just a different way of representing that ownership. And that might be useful if you want that ability, for example, to trade intraday, if you want the ability to have a little more flexibility that the ETFs have. But at the same time, as I mentioned, they're quite comparable in terms of performance. So one should not expect a major difference in performance over long periods of time between these two if they're modeling the same type of return or benchmark, that is. Now, that those are passively managed instruments, meaning those instruments don't have any human intervention in terms of what to buy and sell at any given day. They're following a set formula, typically tied to matching, not beating, but matching a benchmark, a designated benchmark. And then the flip side to that is an actively managed mutual fund or an actively managed ETF. And the main distinction there is these instruments are designed to hopefully beat a benchmark, not to match them, but to do better than the benchmark.
So the mutual funds, or I guess it's kind of important section, whether it's mutual fund or ETF, it's the active management where there's a person trying to do better, or more likely a team trying to do better than their benchmark. But the passive are just trying to replicate the benchmark, whether it's mutual fund or ETF.
Right.
Okay. So I think that distinction you made about like Vanguard can even do a conversion from a mutual fund to an ETF if it's functionally the same, so probably tracking the same index. That's a really good point. That in many ways they are functionally the same. That it's considered a non-taxable event. You're not selling out of one and buying a different thing. You're just converting the type of share class that you're in. I think with ETFs, because they have intraday trading, you could do things like limit orders and stop orders. So you can be a little more creative for buying into or selling these ETFs because they do technically trade like stocks. With mutual funds, in the past, they did better reinvesting dividends. That's a good default process. Whereas when the stocks inside the ETF issue a dividend that gets paid out across all of the dividend shareholders, there wasn't necessarily a process in the past to reinvest those dividends. Now that's pretty much fairly easy to reinvest in ETFs. I think all the custodians we've talked about that would do that fairly easily. So that's now less of a concern. In the past, it was the case that if you were investing, say, $500 per month into your Roth IRA, so kind of what we did for my sister, we did her 2020 contribution of $6,000, and then for 2021, we set up a systematic investment of $500. So the ACH, so she has the bank account routing number and account number, is going to pull $500 per month from her checking to her Roth IRA. It's going to do the same thing for her husband. And so that's $500 per month is going into the Roth IRA moving forward. That wasn't also, again, the money into the account does not necessarily mean it's going to be invested, but most custodians do a great job now of, yes, I'm going to pull 500 and invest it in the mutual fund I already own. Because the mutual fund is kind of creating shares, it's also very easy to do partial shares. So you make a purchase of exactly $500 each month. In the past, that may not have been the case with ETFs, but now they've gotten pretty good. You can do partial shares of ETFs. So you can do that $500 investment each month into that Vanguard target date index ETF fairly easily.
To be clear, though, I did check. The Vanguard doesn't have the target dates for the ETFs. It's just for the mutual funds.
Just for the mutual funds? Okay.
Yeah.
So,
but nevertheless, there may be a broker that does do that for the ETFs. I'm not sure, but just from what I found with Vanguard, it's the mutual funds.
Yeah. I think it comes to how who's creating the rules for that change in allocation, because that is kind of technically a strategy change. We are selling some of our stocks and buying more bonds and doing this systematically. Even though the rules are written in advance, there's kind of someone who made those rules in the first place. I think for Vanguard, it's Vanguard themselves are choosing that allocation. For other ETFs, they're relying on one of the index companies to create that kind of index for them. And so that might be how it could be done as an ETF. But if Vanguard is choosing the allocation, then it makes more sense that they are doing it as a mutual fund. But because they're kind of writing the rules once, and then there's no person or team that they need to have doing kind of fundamental stock analysis, they don't have to pay that team, so they can keep their expenses really low.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think that was the key for my sister, is opening up the Roth IRA in her name, opening the Roth IRA in her husband's name, doing it, linking the bank account via routing number and account number to an ACH transfer. We did $6,000 for the prior year's contribution. Then we then we did a purchase into the American Funds Growth Fund America. Then we set up $500 per month. So she kind of encouraged that systematic savings. So it's going to pull $500 per month from her checking account. It's also going to be invested in that same mutual fund. And so she's kind of, from that perspective, those accounts are on good autopilot for a while. She's going to keep saving that. If IRA contribution amounts do go up over year as Congress and IRS kind of increase those due to inflation. So it would not surprise me if it goes from $6,000 to $6,500. Then I'll have to kind of check in with her and tell her to increase her monthly contribution from $500 to $541.66. To make sure we're maxing out that out each year. But she's set up a pretty good autopilot. The other side that comes up is I have some money and I'm already taking care of the retirement stuff through 401ks, or I'm already doing Roth IRAs. Now, what should I do? So now we're getting into the non-qualified accounts or the taxable accounts. So what is your kind of initial guidance if you determine it's not retirement, it's not going to be used in the next 2 years, but it'll probably be used sooner, maybe on the scale of 5 to 10 years. And let's say they're willing to be somewhat aggressive. What would you recommend when it comes to thinking about non-qualified accounts, and what's that process like?
Right. And at this point, what we're kind of saying is we've already maxed out all of the qualified options, whether it's through an employer or it's through these individual retirement accounts. The last thing I may add, though, is if somebody has a small business, it's also worth checking, are there other options that small business, if they own a small business, that they might consider in terms of adding more flexibility for a set of retirement accounts for the actual business and the business's employees. Like if it's an individual sole proprietorship or a mom and pop shop, well, they might consider having an individual 401k plan. So just make sure that what I like to do is make sure that all of the tax shelters that are possible are maxed out before we start thinking about taxable accounts. But yeah, when we're thinking about taxable accounts, well, then an initial question first is this going to be an individual or is it going to be a joint account? And the reason this comes up now is because when you're talking about all the other type of retirement accounts, those are actually tagged back to an individual. In fact, with an IRA, it's in the name. It's an individual retirement account. You can't actually have a joint IRA, meaning it must be tied back to a person who is having earned income that's using that for retirement. But with a taxable account, now we do have this question that should it be an individual or a joint account? And the reason this kind of comes up is because there's some understanding that assets could be owned individually or they could be owned between a husband and a wife. And in most scenarios, it might help to have assets held jointly, but however, there are some situations where having individual assets might be sensible. For example, if you received money as an inheritance and you want to kind of keep that as not part of the marital estate, but as part of your own estate, then you may want to keep that money in an individual account so that it doesn't kind of get commingled. Now, we went through more of the nuances with this type of concern when we talked about the distinction between community property and separate property. But again, we want to try to keep it a little basic for this conversation. So at the high level, we just want to think, is this money going to be my money or is it going to be jointly owned between myself and my partner? And in that case, you would just open up that specific type of account. And again, this is a taxable account. So then you kind of have the same questions on, okay, now you need to fund the account. And once you fund the account, meaning you've transferred money in from your bank, then you need to figure out what to invest in. If we're thinking in the 5 to 10 year timeframe, Aaron, as you suggest, then it may not be as aggressive of an allocation as we might think about for retirement money that's in the decades timeframe. However, this also depends on individual preferences. So we might just have a little conversation on, just someone's risk tolerance and what they're thinking about. And the other thing we want to understand is roughly, is this money for speculation? We talked a little bit about what might somebody do for having some sort of speculative interest in how the markets are going. And we did talk about that when we talked about Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But if it's more for a set goal and it's more designed to be kind of passive in nature, then it just might be, instead of that more aggressive allocation that we have for retirement, if we're talking 5 to 10 years, it just might be a more conservative allocation to kind of match that duration.
Yeah, and actually, this tends to be where I'm more likely to use something like those target date funds. I think actually, if you were to do a, say, target date 2030, something like that, that's going to be a pretty good mixture of stocks and bonds, and a pretty good asset allocation. I also like iShares has a few allocation ETFs, so you can actually get an aggressive allocation, a moderate allocation, a conservative allocation. The aggressive, I think, is on the scale of 70 to 80% stocks, and the rest is bonds. But these are also, you don't necessarily need that declining risk tolerance that the target date funds have. This could be, you might not need it. You don't know what's kind of for. It might be 5 plus 10 years out, but if it's going to keep going longer, that's a possibility. Then maybe choosing one of the allocation ETFs might make a little more sense, where it's kind of maintaining that same allocation instead of decreasing the risk tolerance over time. But this is where I'm more likely to use one of the ETF strategies. The other reason is actually because of taxes. With actively managed mutual funds, if the fund is doing well, it's going up. One of the things that they do is, as they sell stocks inside the mutual fund, they have to pay out those capital gains to the owners of the mutual fund, to the shareholders. And so if it's doing well, you might actually have capital gain distributions where they're paying out a portion of that, and that's a taxable event to you. Now, if it's in an IRA, it doesn't matter because all the growth is tax deferred. You don't pay taxes along the way. It allows us to choose investments that are specifically not tax efficient. In a taxable account, the individual or the joint account, you need to be at least conscious of the fact that even if you don't sell your mutual fund or your ETF, you are responsible for dividends and capital gains that get paid out. And so you'll actually get a 1099 each year from the custodian saying, here's all the taxable income you received from your investments. ETFs and passive strategies tend to have very little capital gains, if any. It's actually very possible they just don't have any. But they do have a relatively consistent dividend. So because they own a lot of stocks and those stocks issue dividends, you will be getting paid out on the scale of 1 to 2% per year in the form of taxable dividends. Again, it depends on the type of investments. If you're choosing a muni bond ETF, it's all going to be likely tax-free municipal income. If you're choosing a S&P 500 large cap, it's going to be a 1 to 2% yield. If you do something like the large cap growth or a small cap growth, it's possible they don't have those dividend yields. So it's possible you don't see that little taxable income as much. If you did, say, large cap value or even a sector ETF, it tend to issue larger dividends. Utilities and a lot of other kind of dependable, trying to think, the consumer, was it consumer, like what do grocery stores fall under? I forget. It's the consumer defensive, I think.
Yeah, would that still be discretion or staples, right?
Staples, yes, there you go. Where these are companies that will likely be fairly stable regardless of economic environment because people still need to go to the grocery store to buy food. So there are certain types of sectors or indices that will have higher dividends. And so if it's like a large cap value or something like that, you could see getting something on the scale of 3 to 4, maybe even 5% of the portfolios is being paid out as dividends. And in a taxable account, you do have to pay those. So that's why I tend to prefer the passive ETFs in the taxable accounts and I use the more aggressive active managed funds inside retirement accounts. So do you tend to, well, I guess, what do you recommend for a friend or family member using a taxable account? Do you have something that have recommended in the past?
So since I'm fairly passive in general, whether it's retirement or in taxable accounts, one thing I do think about is just the tax efficiency of investments. So if it's for a simple scenario where we're thinking about these accounts in silos and they have similar investment durations, then it might be pretty much the same allocation in the taxable and and the tax deferred account.
Mm-hmm.
However, there would be that difference with the bonds, as you had mentioned. For example, if somebody is in a high tax bracket, then the bonds would be more municipal bonds in the taxable account, whereas they might be a more globally diversified set of bonds in the tax deferred account. However, if we, again, with clients, I do get a little bit more nuance in terms of placing assets that are more tax efficient in the taxable accounts and putting assets that are more tax inefficient in the retirement accounts. What that typically does mean, though, is this is known as an asset location strategy. You might locate assets that are more likely to have dividends and capital gains in the tax deferred accounts, meaning the retirement accounts might have those assets that have high growth, high taxes, and the taxable accounts might have more of the bonds, especially the munis.
Yeah, and so there's in taxable accounts, I guess there's just a little bit more attention to pay. It's less likely to have as good default rules as we do with the Roth IRAs. And sometimes having the kind of tax inefficient corporate bonds in your taxable account, that's okay. You might pay a little bit more taxes at the end of the year than you need to, but still being invested and getting a tax bill is better than just leaving it in cash. Kind of your default process should not be the paralysis by analysis and leaving it in cash out of fear. It's okay, let's invest it in something, and then we can kind of tweak that something to match your individual household income and tax situation and your risk tolerance, and kind of what is the money for, the time frame. So I think investing in something is a good start. And that's why I tend to like those allocation ETFs. But you're right. If we want to apply just that next step, it would be looking for muni bonds on the bond side, especially if it's going to be on that 5 to 10 year time frame. And so now you do want to pay a little bit of attention to kind of rebalance between the stock side and the muni bond side. I don't know of too many ETFs or mutual funds that will incorporate state-specific muni bonds into their allocation. There are California muni bond ETFs and mutual funds, because I'm in California, so I think they'd be the same in most states that have higher state income tax rates. But even if you can't find those state-specific muni bond ETFs, and there's no real allocations for them, you could do it yourself, but then you have to start kind of rebalancing because the stocks will outpace the bonds, and it'll probably at least once a year you want to go back and say, okay, we're going to sell some of the stocks that did well and buy more of the bonds to maintain our allocation. And that's kind of getting down to the level of now you have to pay attention. It's already no longer the easy default process. So that's why sometimes just it's okay if we're slightly tax inefficient as long as we're growing.
Yeah, it kind of begs the notion that if we're really thinking simple, that target date fund may kind of avoid some of these complications.
Yeah.
It'll get you pretty far.
I agree. But yeah, with the taxable accounts, remember you're going to get a 1099. If you sell and you have a capital gain, you'll also get a 1099 for that. So you want to kind of be prepared for those, especially if there's a big capital gain. It might be worth setting aside some money to cover the taxes come next spring. So that's something to be aware of. Don't just sell something, realize the capital gain, and invest all that money again in those taxable accounts. Then you might end up getting a big tax bill next spring that you don't have the money to pay for. So being aware that as you place trades and make actions on the investment inside a taxable account, even if you don't take any money out of the account, the trades and investments themselves are generating the taxes. Unlike the qualified accounts, the trades, investments inside don't impact taxes at all. It's only money in or money out of the account that impacts the taxes. And that's one of the key kind of important distinctions for today.
Good stuff, Aaron.
So open your Roth IRA, contribute $6,000, put it in a target date ETF, and you'll be fine. Just make sure you're doing this. Keep saving every year.
Right.
Anything beyond that, it helps to have a financial advisor as a family member. Anything else you want to add, Trishul?
Well, hopefully we laid some groundwork to at least get people going in the right direction. So thanks, Aaron. I appreciate this conversation.
I agree. I like this conversation a lot. I think you're right. The groundwork is do something. Don't be afraid and leave it in cash.
Right.
So, okay. Well, we'll try and figure out what the next step is next week.
Good stuff. Thanks, Aaron. And thanks, everybody, for listening. If you're enjoying these conversations, do spread the word.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.